Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Monroe County Recovery Summit hosted by the Substance Use Disorder Awareness Commission. I'm Erica Oliphant, the Monroe County Prosecuting Attorney and Chair of the Planning Committee for our event today. So if you have any questions, you can grab me out of the space and ask. So the goal of the Recovery Summit since its inception has been to bring community leaders from diverse backgrounds together to provide a unified approach to aid those people who are experiencing addiction or chaotic drug use that is impacting their lives in a negative way. So the more robust the support structure that we can provide for those people who are experiencing chaotic drug use and addiction, the better the outcomes we can expect for them. Real hope comes from genuine human connection. So we are very excited to be reconvening this event after the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we realized that isolation can have tragic results for people who are struggling. And it's time to rebuild connections and collaborations that may have languished, as well as to explore some new opportunities for partnerships that may lead us to some creative solutions to address substance use disorder. This year, we are dedicating the program to Dr. Greg May. His work and legacy were awesome, and we do have his mother and sister here with us today. I can think of no one who better represented the collaborative spirit than Greg. Greg devoted his career and life to saving the lives of those who experience substance use disorders. He held many leadership roles at Centerstone in his 20-year career there. And when he was at Centerstone, I had the great pleasure of serving with Dr. May on the Monroe County Drug Treatment Court team. I was on the Substance Use Disorder Awareness Commission when Greg was the president. And we also served together on the multidisciplinary stakeholder group that helped to implement the Stride Center here in Monroe County. So, I loved working with Greg. He really showed up for his community with compassion, expertise, and strength. He knew who to bring to the table to accomplish big goals. So in 2021, Greg moved from Centerstone to Medmark, where he implemented policies to make medicated assisted treatment more accessible and effective for those people who were served there. So he really was a powerhouse. Unfortunately, Greg passed suddenly at the age of 41 a couple of years ago, and he was able to pack a full lifetime's legacy of love and support for people in recovery into that time. It's my understanding that when folks learned that we were dedicating our program today to Dr. May, that many people had stories that they'd hoped to share. We do have a really full agenda today, so there won't be an opportunity to do so on stage, but I encourage you to do that amongst yourselves. And also just let's follow in his footsteps and use him as a beautiful example of the power of collaboration and connection. All right. I hope you'll go along with me on this, but I'd like to take a moment to help us set our intention for this day. So one thing that didn't make it into my bio, into the program, is that I teach a meditation class at KMC Bloomington, lunchtimes, Mondays, if you're ever interested in joining us. And so I'd like us to just engage in a very short breathing meditation and help get our mind settled for this event. So if you would please just find a comfortable posture. You want your back to be straight yet relaxed. You can have your eyes closed or partially closed and your hands in your lap, and I'll just give you a second to settle. Without changing anything, start to focus on the feeling of your breath at the tip of your nostrils. You may notice a cool sensation as you breathe in and a warm sensation as you breathe out. Just focus on the sensation for a moment. if you're feeling any tension or pain or negativity, imagine it gathering up within you in the aspect of black smoke. On your next exhalation, imagine that the smoke leaves your body and dissolves completely into space. Once you've spent a few breaths letting go of any negativity that you're experiencing, imagine that with your next inhalation, your body fills completely with white light. This light serves to energize you for the day ahead. Now we'll take a moment to set an intention for today. At the summit, we will learn from experts in the field of recovery. We will have the opportunity to network with peers and community leaders, building connections that could lead to fruitful partnerships that expand access to care and support for those experiencing chaotic drug use. We can think, I wish to engage fully in today's offerings so that I may be of benefit to myself and others. You may now relax your concentration and bring your attention back into the room. All right, I appreciate you doing that with me. Before we move forward with our program, first I want to announce an upcoming event. This is Recovery Month, September. The color, as you may have surmised, is purple. We have an event on the courthouse lawn on Friday, September 20th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's Paint the Town Purple. This has been an ongoing event every year to celebrate recovery efforts. And there's usually some fun games and information, and sometimes there's a DJ. Anyway, it should be a lot of fun. So if you have time, please come to Paint the Town Purple, September 20th, Courthouse Lawn. I'd like to take a moment to highlight our platinum sponsor, the Office of the Mayor of the City of Bloomington. Thank you, Mayor Thompson, for your support of this event and for all of your hard work in this community. Further, I'd like to acknowledge our silver sponsors, the Community Foundation of Bloomington and Monroe County. Thank you for your support. As well as the Monroe Convention Center, which gave us this beautiful space for this event. The Recovery Summit would not be possible without the support of all of our generous sponsors. And so please note that there is a full list of sponsors in the back of your program, and we will also be showing them on slideshows today. But if you get an opportunity to meet them, there are tables over here in the Duke room, and I encourage you to make some connections, get to know them, and thank them for their support. The planning committee for this event is in attendance, and we're all happy to help. We should be available throughout the day if you have any questions or concerns. If you were on the planning committee and you're in this room, could you please stand up and wave? All right, I see Ashley Collins from Centerstone, Commissioner Penny Givens. We've got John Simmons from the School of Nursing back there. We've got Peter Iverson, County Council, Melanie Vesledge from the Health Department. There's a lot of us, so if you need to just grab us out of the air and ask us a question, we'd be happy to help. I really would like to personally thank all the members of the planning committee. We had a really nice meeting yesterday where we expressed our excitement about this event, and we're glad that you're here with us. But their hard work really and their vision brought some really wonderful speakers here for you today, and so I hope that you enjoy them as much as we are excited to have them. I joked that I was really just there to push everybody around, but they did the hard work. So I hope you really enjoy the Recovery Summit and leave today with a new knowledge and understanding, with names and contacts for partners and resources in the community, but most importantly, with hope that we can come together and create a comprehensive safety net for those experiencing chaotic substance use and those seeking and holding fast to recovery. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium now Monroe County Commissioner Penny Givens to get our program started. So thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, yes. I have the best assignment today, and that is to introduce my friend, Professor Bernice Pescasolido. It took me 3 years to learn how to say Pescasolido, okay? But Bernice is a distinguished professor of sociology at Indiana University and founding director of both the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health Services Research and the new IRSE Institute that targets research in the socio-medical sciences. She's an elected member of both the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. Very few people in the whole country hold both positions. She's trained as a medical sociologist at Yale. Her research focuses on connectedness and suicide, the stigma of mental illness and addiction, international issues in health and healthcare, and social networked pathways to treatment. Her concerns have spanned local, national, and international questions and problems, primarily targeting mental illness. In particular, she is concerned with how social and organizational networks facilitate or frustrate people's responses to problems. Her research, supported by several NIH institutes, NSF, and private philanthropy, has been published broadly across scientific and policy journals, and she has received multiple awards for research, teaching, and particularly for her mentorship. When Bernice talks about her students, she lights up. It's incredible. I wish I had known her years ago to have studied with her or worked with her. For 40 years, research on stigma waned. That is, until 1996, when Professor Pescasolido initiated a major national study of the stigma of mental illness in the United States, research which produced some of the groundwork for the Surgeon General's report on mental health, the 2013 White House Conference on Mental Health, and the 2016 NASM report, Ending Discrimination Against People with Mental and Substance Use Disorders, the Evidence for Stigma Change. She's currently involved in as a scientific advisor and organizer for several stigma reduction efforts. This includes organizations like the National Football League, the World Psychiatric Association, and the program at IU, Bring Change to Mind, which she helped create with actress Glenn Close. Now imagine you get a call and it's Glenn Close and you think somebody's spoofing you, right? Well, this happened. This truly happened to Bernice. So there's one thing that probably never appears in introductions of Professor Pescasolido, and that is that she grew up in Rhode Island. And you're going to hear this word a lot, I think, today. But I bring this up because on the Rhode Island flag, there is one word: hope. Breaking down stigma is one of the ways to help people in recovery, one of the ways we can give them hope. So with that, please welcome my friend, Professor Bernice Pescasolido.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. You know, when Penny called, I rarely refuse Penny anything. So when she said there's this recovery summit and we'd like you to come speak, I thought to myself, well, that's not what, what do I know about recovery? So the first thing I want to do is to thank all of you in the room for the work that you do. I'm sure many of you know that in the United States, we have experienced an unprecedented drop in life expectancy. And there are 3 fundamental causes for that, one of them being deaths from overdose. So the work that you do is historic in terms of seeing if we can bend the curve back upward and continue the progress that the United States had seen since 1900 in terms of rising life expectancy. So I puzzled over this for a long time, though, like, what can I do? Yes, it's true, the Irsay Institute, many of you know the Irsay family and know that they have struggled themselves with issues of substance abuse and addiction. And what was really fascinating to me was that the NFL at one point said to all the franchises, you need to pick a philanthropic cause that represents your franchise. And I had no idea, but our Indianapolis Colts picked Kicking the Stigma. They didn't know us, we didn't know them. They didn't know that we do the U.S. National Stigma Studies down here in Bloomington. And so I finally got up the gall to call and talk to them about that. And it's been a really good partnership, I think, since. But I still didn't feel like I knew what I had to offer all of you who are doing this great work in recovery until I got this. Right? I got this flyer. I think somebody sent it to me in the email. I printed it off, and I saw the word connections. And I thought, that's why Penny called me, because I know something about connectedness. So today what I hope to do is to talk about the science that underlies the power of connectedness that might be useful in the work that you do. So I want to start by talking about some of the things that we know about connectedness, where it has gone off the rails, where we've made progress, what the challenges are for us who study this, and what kinds of new directions are happening. So the idea that connectedness matters for people's health and well-being is not a new insight, right? Even in ancient Rome, they talked, about the importance of connectedness for people when they fall ill. The way it's come up now, though, is that our current Surgeon General was not the first. Actually, the CDC was the first to talk about the importance of connectedness in the reduction of suicide in the United States. But our new Surgeon General really has sort of focused on this issue of connectedness and why it matters for our health and our mental health. Now, this is from he has a slide deck on the issue of connectedness, and I think we now know that the science is very clear. It's undisputed that social connections matter for life, happiness, well-being, recovery, all of these things. In fact, it comes by many names. We're talking about connectedness today, but social support was really the first scientific way that this was conceptualized, social networks, and there's even a whole discipline now called network science that looks at these fundamental connections. But I think when you look at the Surgeon General's slide, I think it's really helpful when we talk about individuals connecting with one another. But I would call that network light. Network light in the sense that connectedness matters at many levels. Already we've heard today about other levels that matter for recovery. So I think what I'd like to do is bring some of the research that would help us think more deeply about the notion of connectedness, and that we can do better in taking these scientific concepts and translating them into the kinds of things that we can do to prevent overdose, to stop drug addiction, and to help people recover when they do go down that path. So let's get down to business on this and how connectedness can help and hurt recovery. And that's the other thing. I think while it's great that medicine has sort of glommed on to the social science notion of connectedness, they still only think of it in some ways as a positive. And the only negative they think about is the absence of connectedness. And I don't think that's quite where we are in terms of the science. In fact, as we were talking about and we were introduced to the conference today, you mentioned the safety net, right? In fact, that's the way that social scientists think about every social group. That whether you're talking about your family, your community, the organization that you work in, sociologists have said that there are two fundamental axes that create connectedness in every group that exists. One is integration, which is love, caring, and concern. And we know that that matters for individuals that are facing problems. But also there's another dimension, which is regulation. And that's how much you guide people. That's how much you give them the kind of advice that will help them along their way. It's whether or not you coerce organizations to treat people with drug addictions fairly when providing care, right? So when we think about the social safety net that sociologists came up with over 100 years ago, we've translated that into connectedness terms and into network terms specifically. And we think of it as a safety net where the real power of connectedness is when you're at the bottom of the net, right? Think about this for a minute. So you have all seen tightrope people, and then they have the safety nets under them. The best place for them to fall when they fall off of the trapeze or whatever they're doing up in the air is in the middle of the net. Because when you have a moderate amount of social integration and social regulation in an organization, from the family all the way up through political organizations, you have the greatest give, you have the greatest flexibility, you can do the most with that connectedness. What is problematic is when individuals slide for some reason away from the bottom of the net, so that you get two situations, which sociologists called anomie and egoism, where the ropes of the tightrope of the safety net are so far apart that when an individual falls off of the tightrope of their life, they can't grab on to anything. The ropes are too far apart and they fall through. And that, I think, is what the Surgeon General was talking about. But we also know that networks can be damaging for individuals. If they slide up the two other sides of the net, being altruism and fatalism, the safety net, the ropes of the safety net become so close together that it becomes a wall that shatters people when they hit it, right, rather than helping them. So we have to think both about the positive power of connectedness and the potential damage that too tight connections can do. So I think one of the first things we need to move away from is this notion that all networks are good, right? All networks are not good. And I don't think anybody knows that more than people in this room when you understand the power of networks that involve addiction, whether it's individuals who only hang out with other people who are also addicted, or whether we talk about the social networks of drug cartels, right? So we have to also attack the bad networks as well as create the good networks. So the point is, both too much and too little can be problematic for individuals, organizations, and social structures. And then the other thing we have to think about, it's not just the connectedness, but what is in those social networks. What is the sort of beliefs that they hold? What is the culture? Do they think about other people as, people who have addictions, do they think about them as good people or people with bad character? How does culture help those networks heal or endanger individuals? So we know that it matters, right? And so these are the first graphs I'm going to show you from the national stigma studies that we do here at IU and that Penny mentioned. And one of the things that we measure in that is we measure social distance, which is a really solid measure of stigma and social exclusion. It's a measure that asks whether or not you'd be willing to interact with a person. Now, what we do in these studies is we don't ask people, would you like to sit on the bus next to a person who has a drug addiction, right? Why? Well, first of all, you can't necessarily see drug addiction, number one, so it doesn't match what people see in the community. But also, we don't know what they're thinking of. Are they thinking of somebody who smokes pot every night, or are they thinking of someone who's shooting heroin? So what we did in these studies, which was a methodological innovation, was that we created these little stories called vignettes. And that's what people face in the community, a person who's behaving in a certain way, right? And so one of the things that this allows us to do is to see whether or not they actually recognize drug addiction when they see it. Do they recognize depression that may accompany drug addiction or may even be part of the reason that people become addicted to drugs? And so what you see here is over 3 points in time, how Americans react to people in these vignettes. And the focus I want you to focus on the light blue line, because the light blue line is the one substance that we have in these studies, which is alcohol. And what you see in every single graph is that it is the alcohol vignette compared to the mental illness vignette that engenders the most stigma from the American population. And I want you to hold that in your mind for a minute because I'm going to show you another graph in a second. The other thing that I want you to know from our studies is that that alcohol abuse is the only situation, the only disorder that we talk about where our ideas about what causes them have gone backward, right? So one of the things that we trace in the U.S. national stigma studies is whether or not people think the underlying causes of mental illness and addiction have to do with, genetics, biology, chemical imbalances, or whether or not it has to do with moral causes like weakness and bad character. And if you look at that last graph, you see the one, what we call attribution, that's gone in the wrong direction. In our last study, there's a significant relationship where more Americans are saying that people who have alcohol abuse are, in fact, it's a result of bad character. So that's a step backwards that we don't see for mental health, but we do see for addiction. The other thing that we're associated with here at the Irsay Institute is Shatterproof. And Shatterproof has created essentially a national stigma study for drug addiction. And one of the things that we do the analysis for them, it's actually an advocacy group that's trying to deal with the stigma of addiction. And we told them that one of the things that would be useful is if they actually knew what they had to fight. And so it's much more detailed on the different kinds of substance use that people are dealing with. And what we see here is the hierarchy from alcohol, right, which is going in the bad direction in American society in terms of thinking what causes it, is the lowest amount of stigma compared to even prescription opioids, heroin, or methamphetamines. I think the good news is that when we had stories, the same story, but the person was actively using versus in recovery, that there was about a 10% drop in stigma if they were in recovery. So we know that recovery matters in terms of how individuals will be treated in society. So these are the kinds of things that we hope that we bring to the table that might be useful in your work. I wanted to make a small clinical point about this. If networks are so important, why don't we know about this when people come for treatment or when people are in recovery? I think that there are people who are working on this issue, but I think we're trying to figure out a way how to get networks into the electronic health records so that providers have a sense of what kind of addiction problem and possibility for recovery that people are facing. Because it matters. If you look at the 3 network structures here, it matters whether or not the person is in what we call a concentric circle structure, which means that, it's a very tight structure that can either be very good, that there are lots of people to help them with recovery, or if they're deeply embedded in a drug network, how hard it's going to be to get them, away from substance use. And it matters whether or not, if you look at the bottom graph, whether or not they are isolated. That's the Surgeon General's person in the bottom there, that they might have connections, but the connections are not really connected, and they sort of stand in the middle. And we find in mental illness that it's very hard for people with mental illness to sort of maintain those active ties, in part because of their disorder, but also in part because of the stigma. So trying to get a sense of what people's networks look like when we're trying to provide treatment and assist with recovery matters. But we haven't quite figured out exactly how to get this into the interactions with providers that can be useful. There are people doing it, but we haven't found a way to make it something that we can disseminate widely. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, the first thing that you should know is that our research shows that PSA campaigns are not the best way to go, okay? They're not bad, right? But they're not as effective as many other anti-stigma efforts. Unless it's in one site and one organization where there can be sustained time, money, and commitment to that PSA campaign, they tend not to have the effects that we're hoping for. And they tend to be very expensive if you're talking about national media or even local media of any type. And the other thing that we know is that PSA campaigns are better if there's active participation of people with the campaign. You're not just throwing things at them, showing things, but somehow there's a way that they can interact with the campaign. What the research shows very clearly is the best way to reduce stigma around issues like mental health and substance abuse is contact. But it's not just any contact. It's important that, we know that people who, in our studies, who report that they have contact with people with mental health or addiction have lower levels of stigma, okay? But not everybody who reports contact with people with mental illness or addiction issues has lower stigma. They have to be people who have had more people that they know, they've had positive relationships with them. People who just have peripheral ties, they actually tend to be more stigmatizing. So contact matters, but it's the type of contact that matters in terms of your experience in life. And if you're going to actually use contact to create anti-stigma efforts for individuals, they need to have a certain set of characteristics that I've listed there that go all the way back to Gordon Allport's ideas about how do we reduce prejudice in general. You need to involve people in an effort that is not hierarchical, where there's a goal that they mutually set and they have equal status to work together to that goal. I think a really interesting example of that that we were talking about earlier is that we're working with the state in getting a sense of how the new crisis mobile teams are working. And one of the sticking points is really about the peer-to-peer requirement. It's a great requirement, but people are having trouble. The trainings are expensive, they're not that often, and this is something that really needs to be dealt with if we're going to use the contact hypothesis as a basis for the kinds of things that we're doing. What we find is more effective in reducing stigma is actually sharing stories of experience. Okay, this is something that Penny mentioned Glenn Close, and she did call me out of the blue one day, and I did think she was punking me, and I was probably not very polite in responding to her. I mean, in a funny way. I thought it was somebody that I knew punking me. But anyway, But, you know, when she called me, she said a couple of things. You know, she said, I want to start an advocacy organization because my sister, who we all just thought was a wild child, came up to me and said, Glennie, I can't stop thinking about killing myself. And finally, she got a correct diagnosis, and she has serious mental illness. And Glenn said she's tired of wearing gowns, which she hates, by the way, and going to, you know, galas and writing checks. She said, I really want to do something. And I'm thinking, oh, here we go. You know, she's going to want to do a PSA campaign. And she kind of did. But she's very smart, and she's very tied in. And we kind of talked her out of doing PSA campaigns for the most part, right? But why I agreed to work with her is that she said two things. The first thing she said was, I want my advocacy organization to be based on science and family. And you don't hear that very often, those two together. And you don't usually hear with PSA campaigns science mentioned very often. And the second thing was, she says, I want the tagline to be ending stigma by starting the conversation. Well, that lined up very closely with where our research had gone in terms of thinking about this. And it turns out that the research shows that video stories, you know, where people can discuss in a group afterwards, are just as effective as having people come and do it live. So that's a much better approach if you want to think about, you know, what to do in terms of stigma reduction. But the second point I want to make, and I think a lot of you already hear when I heard the introduction today, is that, you know, this is why I find the Surgeon General to be network light, okay? Because connections also exist in organizations, right, and groups. And these are just as important as dyads or, you know, person to person. Because what happens in an organization or a group is that the network structure creates a climate that is either accepting of the recovery idea or one that thinks that people can never recover. And that was actually, in my own research, the hardest time I had convincing people at the National Institutes of Health that it might be the case that the social networks in their clinics were actually not helping people because they didn't believe in the concept of recovery, or they didn't believe that it mattered how happy the people working in their organization were, okay? So when we think about this, it's not just the provider-patient relationship, which, you know, people have been talking about for hundreds of years, but literally the larger cultural climate that is created by the interactions between the providers and the people who run the organization, and both of those groups and the clients that they serve. So some very strong research came out of the University of Tennessee that showed that if you had networks that were open and supportive, that they actually had better recovery rates, that if people were given the same kind of treatment in organizations that were sort of closed and held beliefs that people could not recover. It seems like an obvious point to me, but I had to submit a grant 4 times before I could convince anybody at the National Institute of Mental Health that organizational networks mattered, that a pill is not a pill, that a CBT is not a CBT because of the cultural climate. They just didn't want to believe that what happens in an organization matters if they had the right treatment. But we finally kind of convinced them. So when we think about the safety net, we can think about it the way the Surgeon General did, which is the arrow, which is the little safety net right above the arrows, right? We can think about person-to-person interaction. But I think in order to truly get to recovery, we need to think about the levels above. And the first level above is thinking about organizations where people with addictions go for not just treatment, but for financial help, for advice about different things, that it matters whether or not people in those organizations understand the concept of recovery and support it. So there are also organizational interactions that one can do. So, well, let me start with, you know, how does it matter? Okay, this is a graph that we did recently for NIOSH and OSHA, right? They're interested now in this notion of provider stress, provider attitudes. They may look complex, but they say one thing. which is the level of stigma toward people with mental health and addiction is no different than the level of stigma in provider organizations. That might sound shocking to you, but we have seen this both in terms of our national stigma studies that look at all the different disorders plus alcohol, or in the Shatterproof studies, that there is no difference between the stigma level between providers, and we looked at two kinds of providers: anybody who worked in the healthcare system as a whole, which is the graph on the left, and then people who had higher medical degrees, right? Makes no difference. They hold the same level of stigma. And why shouldn't they, right? We see very little training in the medical helping professions on introducing the concept of stigma or doing any kind of work to reduce the levels of stigma in the caring professions. So this is something that I think we can do if we want to change levels of stigma and produce a new generation of individuals who don't understand the power of stigma and beliefs in terms of recovery. Okay. The other thing that you can do is we're working with Leslie Hulvershorn, who is the chair of psychiatry up at the med school. And she was really concerned. She is somebody who is an addiction specialist. She spends a lot of her time getting kids off of psychiatric drugs when they have addiction problems, which I found shocking when I found out that's what she spends most of her time doing. But she found that outside of Riley, that's a lot of what was happening. And she also found that when kids came in with mental health or addiction problems, that the staff in Riley kind of panicked. They didn't know what to do with them, so often the first thing that they did was call security, and the kids were cuffed or they were put in some kind of detention. So she said, we have to change this. Like, we have got to get people at Riley Hospital, one of the leading children's hospitals in the country, to understand issues of mental health and addiction. So she turned to the School of Public Health here, who has an expert who's part of the Irsay Institute named Hank Green. And Hank does this thing called Game Changers. And this is really an interesting way to reduce stigma and increase knowledge. You don't do it by, again, making people take CME credits where somebody just talks at them, right? They will do those CME credits if they have to, but it doesn't really have the kind of effect. What this does, it's a peer-to-peer effort where you train people who are really, they're sort of like the, I don't know, they're like the voices in the wilderness who understand and care about this issue, and you give them the training to become resource people throughout the hospital, right? So the best thing to do is to do a network analysis of the hospital and find out who are the people that people listen to, and then train the people who are the voices in the wilderness, and then have them become active advocates for changing the culture and climate of, in this case, one of our best places for kids to go for treatment of any kind, but we want to make sure that the treatment for kids who have mental health problems or addiction problems are treated in the same way as the kids who have cancer or the kids who have, problems with their kidneys or whatever. So we're in the middle of testing this at Riley Hospital. We'll let you know how it works out. But this has been successfully applied to HIV in Africa. It's been successfully applied to cancer, female cancer issues in a number of different places. So it's a proven program that we think is another way to think about change. Okay? And then point 3 is really just going up one more level and thinking about the other issues that are important. So this is where we talk about now relationships in the system, right? So we have the mayor here, right? And so what's happening in other non-medical organizations really matter for what happens in the medical organizations or in the treatment organizations. And we have a couple of examples. There's a lot in the literature about, well, not as much as there should be, but there is some very solid evidence that shows that it really matters what kind of discharge planning is happening when people get out of treatment, right? It matters what kinds of relationships those people in the organization that's discharging has with other organizations in the community. This is what we call in network science sort of a brokerage model. The brokers matter, right? In fact, the people who were not readmitted to hospitals after they left, in recovery or heading toward recovery, had network brokers in which the organization's ties were not hierarchical, where they were not unidirectional, and where they were streamlined. So the kind of connectedness matters. And I had my first experience with this in the early days when they actually had a mental health court in Wishart, the old Wishart Hospital. They had a mental health court. And the mental health court not only had an incredible judge, but they also had a group of individuals who sort of triaged every case for the judge and helped to set up those kind of positive relationships with other organizations in the Indianapolis area. So I've actually seen that work. The other thing, and I know that the mayor is very interested in housing. And so Housing First obviously is a permanent supportive housing approach that uses a harm reduction model. And what we find in the studies that have used Housing First, and this actually was a study in Indianapolis, which I have to say I'm very proud of. One of our former students was then hired at IU Indy, and got to be careful, hired at IU Indy, and found that there was network decay. And you're like, oh no, people's networks decayed? It was really good, because the networks that decayed under the Housing First model is that they discontinued negative relationships and they built positive relationships with other people who are in the Housing First program, right? So we have a sense that it's individual networks that matter, clinic networks that matter, or any place people get treatment, where they get their income support, where they get other social services, and it matters the connections between those organizations. So I just wanted to end with one way forward that, it's, academics tend to be people who tell other people what to do, but they don't do it themselves, right? So we wanted not to follow that road. And so in our own backyard, and Penny again mentioned this, what happened, this is another weird story, right, where after I helped Glenn with her organization, helped her build her organization and helped her with some speeches that she needed to do at like the Society for Neuroscience asked her to come speak, right? I said, look, quid pro quo, girl, right? Like I come out there all the time, I help you, you have to come to Bloomington and talk to people. So she did. And there was a dinner with former First Lady Lori McRobbie and Lauren Robel and Jean Robinson. A number of women were at this, which my husband found very offensive. He goes, you wouldn't like it if it was like an organization of all, dinner of all men. And I said, you had your time. This is us. Like, we're building this, right? So anyway, he was a sociologist too, right? So he could appropriately say those kind of statements and we would figure it out. But anyway, so we go and David Talent was doing the dinner, so I was really excited about this. And I got to sit way at the other end of the table, which I loved. Could I have some wine and enjoy my dinner? And there's Lauren and Lori and Glenn, in a huddle. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's not good, right? And all of a sudden I hear, you can do that, Bernice, right? And I was probably a glass of wine behind me, and I'm not a drinker at all. So I was like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, I can do it, right? Then what I found out was that they wanted us to take the principles that we understood and create an anti-stigma program at Indiana University. So that's what we did. The first year, we recruited a good number of kids from the entering cohort of 2014, and we flopped miserably. We learned from that year. We restarted the science in 2015 and enrolled about half of the freshman class or entering class. And under these principles, which I'm not going to go into because I think my time is getting short here, we created, using network principles, You Bring Change to Mind, which is the university version of Bring Change to Mind. That is a peer-to-peer program. It's for students and about students. We also did the science, and when I first got the results from the baseline survey, which was the students as they entered, I was very depressed because unlike the rest of American society, our entering students actually have much lower levels of stigma toward mental health and addiction issues, right? And I thought, well, you know, that's great on the one hand. On the other hand, how are we going to lower that? But we did this program, again, all by students. We supported them in terms of this, but one of the key reasons it works is it's a high-touch program. It has institutional support and institutional buy-in. And at the end of, in the middle of their junior year, we went back to all those students, and we found that we changed not only attitudes, but behaviors, right? And you might ask, well, how did you measure behaviors? Well, one of the key findings was that individuals reported more individuals in their social networks that had mental health issues, right? Now, there are two ways you could interpret that. One is that they knew there was a study, so after freshman year, they ran out and grabbed people who had mental issues and, you know, put them in their networks. I don't think that's what happened. I think what happened was that we really won on the issue of disclosure, and that students were sharing more about their ideas about mental health issues, the stresses they face in college, or whatever. So we are still doing this this effort. It's 10 years now that we've been doing this without any support, because at first Glenn's organization supported the study and the science, but after that we've been doing our best to keep it moving, and I think we're doing okay. But we're also at an interesting place where, when you think about how we built this, you know, we started with the fact that we had ties with a lot of scientists who could advise us. And then we built essentially a Game Changers program. We got a lot of organizations at IU involved. Like, we were like, this is not going to be a standalone. So we got the guy who is the head of VP for enrollment. And you think, well, what good is he, right? He's the guy, I always call him Dumbledore, like he's the Dumbledore of IU, right? I adore him, you know, David Johnson. He's the guy that allows you to send emails to everybody, right? That's a critical network diffusion process. But we got legal involved. We get to use the Trident on our materials. Who knew that that was like something I could go to jail for if I hadn't had legal whatever. But anyway, we got everybody involved in this. And so it still has a lot of support at IU in terms of people who want to participate. We're kind of struggling with the financial issues. But we're also at a point where we think we have a model that could work nationally for free to other universities and colleges. And we've got the partners who are behind us on this in terms of wanting to help us disseminate it. We're still trying to figure out, you know, like where we get this program won't work unless there's a national infrastructure and a place, which I think should be IU, Bloomington, that we can help keep the tie going at the interorganizational level. It now exists on all 9 campuses of Indiana University, so we have done some dissemination, but I've got a list of, you know, 40 or 50 colleges and universities, many of them in Indiana, that would like to do this. So we're just still working at it, which I feel makes me have some connection to all of you who are working so hard on the issue of recovery. And if there's anything that we can do to help, anything that IU can do, that the IRSA can do, please let us know, and we'll try to do the best we can. Thank you. You take questions? Yeah, I mean, I'll take questions, comments, suggestions, donations. I know I've gotten really good at that. Again, something that academics know how to do at all. Anybody have any questions, comments? It's like my freshman class. Yes, Mayor.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Your evolving research is so meaningful to our communities. Have you looked at, or has anyone modeled a community approach to what you're doing on campus with the Game Changer model?
What do you mean? Oh, you mean like using that approach in the community? Yeah, that's a really good question. You know what? I actually think it used to exist. It used to exist in the ACT teams. Do you remember the ACT teams? I thought the ACT teams were an important solution to the problems of mental health and addiction. What the irony was of that was the idea that because it showed how backward we were at the time because we had this model. And you may know that the National ACT Center for Training was up at that time, IUPUI. And the irony was that when they discovered that it was recovery, they said, well, if these people are in recovery, why do they need this? And then state by state, like, Michigan was an ACT state, Texas was an ACT state, So I think that's part of it, because I think, because it had both the team of a multidisciplinary team of providers, so if you were having problems with your landlord, right? I think there's a way to do that. The only place that exists now are in the clubhouse models. There's one in Chicago, and then there's Fountain House in New York, right? But most of the ACT teams, which were sort of funded by the state, have disappeared. So I think we've already shown that a community-based model like that will work.
Thank you.
So the stigma related to addiction, what if the person has more than one stigma? Like you're poor, you're homeless,
Yep.
you're unruly,
Yep.
you can't make appointments,
Yep.
you are an unreliable historian. And so when you have those other layers of stigma, how is decreasing stigma and addiction going to help that go forward for them to access services where they're treated with dignity?
I think that's a really good question. We call that, there's a lot of names for that. It's called the double hit. It's called layered stigma. It's called compound stigma. We are studying that. What we find is, from the point of view of the individuals, that they tend to take one of those things and consider it the major stigma that they face, right? Even if they have all those things. And for a lot of individuals, it will be the mental health or addiction problem. So I think if we can, because there's also self-stigma, right? There's also people, like, they say, oh yeah, I am worthless, or I can't recover, right? So, so I think on every level, if we can reduce that, I think that it would be nice if we were in a country that was like supporting a lot of those other things that you talk about. I don't think we are. But I do think that for many, the addiction or mental health problem, they consider that their master status, their biggest stigma. And so I think it's a first step. It's not a solution. I do think that, I think the research shows pretty clearly that people who are, this and that, are treated worse. The research is kind of thin, but it's there, and a lot of people also call it intersectional stigma. So if you're looking in the research literature, I think that's the preferred term now, intersectional stigma. So for example, have a friend who's developed another interesting program called What Matters Most, and that's where some of this research is coming from, like What Matters Most. So unfortunately, he could only get it funded for HIV, but he was working on HIV in Botswana among women. And what he found was that the stigma for women in Botswana was that people believed they couldn't be good partners because they obviously had sex with lots of people because they got HIV, which of course, not true, right? And they couldn't be good mothers and take care of their children. And so what they did to reduce the stigma of HIV was actually help them with their social skills in how to present themselves. Because they were good mothers and they were good partners, right? But they didn't know how to sort of get past the HIV thing. So I think that there are programs out there that are starting to know how to deal with multiple stigmas. And part of that is trying to understand, like, that's why I get so frustrated with the National Institutes of Health, because all they want are grants on interventions, but they don't know what the target is. I think that that's what IU is providing for them. We're telling them what the targets are about, that have to be addressed, but they just want us to come in with a randomized clinical trial of 12 students in a school, and I'm like, I don't do that kind of research. But I think you're right on, in terms of these most people, either they start from a position of disadvantage or they end up in a position of disadvantage if they have mental health or addiction problems, and we're not dealing with the whole person.
Hello. First off, thank you
Where
for
are you?
being
Oh,
thank you
okay.
Thank you for being here very much. So in the previous slide, you showed a picture of the intra-organizational networks that you have in place. Is there a metric or a bar that you have for people wanting to join that network? because like many of us here, I'm in a lot of these networks, and I would love to join some of this research and work. So do you and the system have metrics for folks like me wanting to join in on this research and building this community and breaking down stigma?
I think that the National Institutes of Health are increasingly requiring that. Again, the job of scientists is not to do things to people. I think the job of scientists is to get a better understanding from people in the trenches and then making them an active participant in research. That is increasingly required. So I think we're looking for that too. But it really depends on the kind of project that we're doing. But what I find is a lot of these organizational networks, people say I'm in this network and that network, they're really not networks in the way that can actively change things, right? Yeah, so I worry about that. I mean, if people are, I would be happy, and I think there are better people than I in the Ursay Institute that could really help advise on how you create the kinds of networks that would change things. And I think part of that, I think it depends on, it's not only that everybody's in it, but it's just like Gordon Allport said, 70 years ago, you've got to have a shared goal that you have some resources for, where you can change things. Because it's really, I mean, I know, you don't have the resources you need to do this work. And so there has to be sufficient resources if there's going to be another level. You can't just take it from where you are now. You're already stretching yourselves to the limit. So I think I think things can be done. I think they're innovative. I think it's possible, and we're willing to help. I don't think we have all the answers, by the way. We're just scientists trying to struggle along on this stuff. But when I introduced the idea that the way that people get into services was not by doing a mental calculus, those were all the models were like, well, I think about how much insurance I have and whether I have to go to work and am I white or black and all these things. I was like, it's not how people get into services. They bounce off other people, right? They say did you have this? What did you do? Or what about that? What's your doctor? When I introduced that, people were horrified that I suggested that the process of getting into services was peopled, not a mental calculus. So, that wasn't that long ago that was like an insight to the National Institutes of Health. So I think we've come a long way, and while I think that, the Surgeon General is network light, I am so grateful and encouraged that he actually gets it on some level. So I think we've made real progress, but we got a long way to go. So thank you. Anybody else? Okay, well, I know you have lots to do today, and I wish you well on your journey. And if there's anything that the Ursay can do to help, please let us know. We are around. So.